It begins quietly, almost too quietly for the human mind to register the significance. At first, it's just another point of light drifting through the velvet darkness of space, a faint whisper on the instruments, a soft tremor in the endless ocean of stars. Nothing about it screams danger or revelation, and yet something in its approach feels different, subtle but undeniable, as if the universe itself has paused for a brief second, drawing in a breath before exhaling a secret it has held for far too long. Imagine yourself floating far above the Earth, suspended in the silent black. The planet beneath you turns slowly, calmly, unaware of the visitor slipping unnoticed through the cosmic tides. You don't hear alarms, you don't see frantic scientists scrambling in observatories. Instead, you see tranquility. A world going about its routines, untouched by the truth racing toward it across unimaginable distances. That is how this story begins. Not with thunder, not with spectacle, but with a whisper. When astronomers first saw it, they didn't gasp. They didn't hold emergency conferences or send immediate alerts. They logged it, noted the coordinates, compared it to known objects, and prepared to move on. After all, space is full of wanderers. Millions of icy fragments roam the void between stars, and most of them pass through our solar system as silent, unremarkable visitors. But sometimes the universe sends something else. Something that does not follow the rules. Something that forces humanity to stop pretending it understands how the cosmos works. The truth is, long before the world heard its name, before the headlines and the debates and the sleepless nights in research centres, there was a moment. A tiny, almost imperceptible moment when a few people looking at the data felt a strange tightening in their chests. A sense that this traveller was not like the others. That this was the beginning of something that would shake the foundations of everything we believe about our place in the galaxy. But they didn't say it out loud. Not yet. At first glance, the object didn't seem threatening or extraordinary. It moved with an elegance that felt almost natural, gliding inward from the cold reaches of interstellar space. Its brightness was modest, its trajectory subtle. To most observers, it appeared to be nothing more than a passing comet, another frozen relic from somewhere unimaginably distant. And yet if you looked closely, very closely, you could sense a kind of quiet tension beneath the surface. A subtle wrongness that scientists struggle to describe even now. It was as if the object had arrived wrapped in a veil of familiarity, concealing the fact that every layer beneath was an anomaly waiting to be uncovered. You see, the universe rarely delivers its mysteries fully formed. It reveals them slowly, deliberately, the way a skilled storyteller draws you deeper into a narrative without you realizing you've already crossed the threshold. This visitor was no exception. It began with soft hints, tiny deviations, the kind you might dismiss if you weren't paying attention. But once noticed, they became impossible to ignore. Orbit, velocity, composition. Every measurement whispered a different kind of question. But those questions would come later. For now, all that mattered was its arrival. There is something almost poetic about the idea of a traveller crossing the abyss between the stars. Think about the distance. think about the time. Think about how many millennia pass while a lone object drifts through absolute nothingness, untouched by gravity or light, until one day, one specific day, it crosses an invisible line and enters the gravitational domain of a small blue world circling a yellow sun. Why here? Why now? Why this path, this moment, this trajectory? These are not the thoughts of someone analysing a rock. These are the thoughts you have when you feel, deep down, that a story is unfolding. A story in which your species might be a character rather than an observer. As the first images sharpened on the screens, the object remained distant, far beyond the orbits of the outer planets. A faint pinprick against a black canvas. But even from that distance, even blurred and pixelated, there was an eeriness to it. Something about the way its brightness pulsed. Something about the way it refused to behave like anything familiar. Tiny irregularities, just enough to provoke curiosity, but not enough to trigger alarm. Not yet. Scientists don't like admitting when something unnerves them. They prefer patterns, equations, explanations that fit within the comfortable boundaries of known physics. But there are moments, rare moments, when the universe hands you something that doesn't fit. Something that forces you to step back and acknowledge the possibility that your understanding is incomplete. This object was one of those moments, and so, without fanfare, without the world noticing, it continued its descent toward the inner solar system. Every hour brought it closer. Every observation revealed another subtle contradiction. And still, the public knew nothing. There were no breaking news stories, no predictions of danger, no dramatic announcements. In those early days, everything was quiet. But beneath that quiet, something profound was beginning to stir. Because sometimes the most extraordinary events in the universe don't begin with chaos. They begin with calm. With a silence so deep you can feel it press against your thoughts. With a sense that the familiar sky overhead is holding a secret, waiting for the right moment to reveal it. And that moment was approaching. Imagine yourself lying on your back under a clear night sky, unaware that a visitor from another star system is already on its way. Imagine how small you feel, how peaceful everything seems, how distant and eternal the stars appear. Now imagine the truth, that among those stars something has shifted. Something has chosen a path that intersects with your world. Something that carries within it a story older than humanity itself. And you don't know it yet. No one does. But soon you will. Because the cosmos doesn't send a message without meaning. It doesn't send a traveler without purpose. And even though the world still slept, even though life continued unchanged on that quiet, unremarkable night, a new chapter in the human story had already begun. A chapter that would lead us into questions we never dared to ask. A chapter that would challenge everything we assume about the universe. A chapter that would begin with a whisper and end with a revelation. And as this silent traveller continued its descent toward the inner solar system, something even stranger began to emerge, something subtle at first, like the faintest shift in the direction of the wind. Astronomers started to map its trajectory more precisely, plotting its curve against the familiar gravitational patterns of the planets, the sun, and the countless hidden influences that shape an interstellar visitor's path. The more they studied it, the more the numbers resisted settling into anything ordinary. Its orbit, instead of aligning with the chaotic randomness expected from an object born in the depths between stars, traced a path with an elegance that felt almost intentional, as though it were following a script written long before humanity learned to measure the heavens. Most interstellar objects, when they enter a solar system, come in at strange angles. They strike from above or below, slicing through the planetary plane like arrows shot from unimaginable distances. They are wanderers with no allegiance to the geometry of any particular star. But this one moved in a way that whispered of improbability. Its path lay nearly flush with the thin disk in which the planets circle our sun, as if it had chosen to merge with the rhythm of our system instead of cutting across it. This is where the first real sense of impossibility began to crystallize. You see, for an object travelling from the void between stars, a void so vast, so indifferent, so directionless, to arrive exactly along the plane where our planet's orbit is like tossing a grain of sand from the edge of a continent and having it land precisely on the line where the ocean meets the shore. Not close to it, not vaguely near, but directly, perfectly on it. The odds are not merely low, they are absurdly, cosmically low. And yet here it was, gliding as though it belonged here all along, and the strangeness didn't end with its alignment. Its orbit was retrograde, moving against the direction in which every major body in our system travels. Imagine walking into a crowded street where thousands of people are flowing forward, and one solitary figure moves silently against the tide. That figure would stand out immediately, unsettling without needing to speak a word. This object was just like that, a quiet defiance of celestial norms, a reminder that something out there was capable of ignoring the gravitational choreography that binds our world. The scientists who saw this began to feel a tightening in their thoughts. They replayed the measurements, ran simulations, rechecked the calibration of their instruments. They convinced themselves there must be an error, because the alternative, the idea that an interstellar traveller chose a path that mirrors the architecture of our solar system, was too heavy to accept without resistance. And so, they revised the data again and again. But the numbers refused to move. They held their shape like the outline of a truth waiting to be spoken. Imagine sitting in a dark room and suddenly you hear a faint whisper behind you. You tell yourself it's the wind, or the creaking of the floor, or your mind playing tricks. But the whisper comes again, a little clearer this time, and though you still can't make out the words, you know they were not an illusion. That is how the orbit of this visitor began to feel, not like a random phenomenon, but like something softly calling attention to itself, asking to be noticed, understood, questioned. And once you start to question something like this, the questions grow quickly. Why did it arrive at this angle? Why now? Why with such precision? When you consider the vast, chaotic, infinite expanse of interstellar space, any form of neat alignment becomes suspicious. But when the alignment is this exact, the suspicion becomes unavoidable. Think of it like dropping a bottle into the ocean and having it wash ashore not just anywhere, but right at your feet, at the precise moment you happen to be standing there. At some point, coincidence begins to lose its power as an explanation. As the object drew closer, more telescopes turned their gaze toward it. Observatories across the world, from the frozen silence of the Atacama Desert to the high-altitude domes atop volcanic peaks, fixed their instruments on the same patch of sky. With every new data point, the orbit became clearer, and the clearer it became, the stranger it looked. What started as a subtle irregularity transformed into a mathematical shout. Nothing about its trajectory matched what physics teaches about natural interstellar debris. The way it curved, the way it dipped, the way it threaded the gap between the stars and the sun, it all pointed to a singular conclusion. This object was behaving too precisely, not wild, not chaotic, precise. The kind of precision that makes the mind uneasy, not because it confirms a fear, but because it opens a door to possibilities we are not accustomed to inviting in. There is a moment when studying the universe where the line between the known and the unknown becomes razor thin. A place where everything you trust your instruments, your equations, your understanding begins to feel inadequate, as if reality itself is gently stepping beyond the limits you once believed were unbreakable. This traveller stepped over that line with the quiet confidence of something that had done it before. And as astronomers watched its course take shape, they couldn't shake the feeling that the object wasn't just entering the solar system, it was navigating it. There was a rhythm to its path, a kind of cosmic courtesy, as though it were aware of the planets it drifted among. That awareness, imagined or not, settled into their minds like a seed that once planted grows into questions that cannot be ignored. If something from another star arrives exactly in the plane of our planets, if it moves against the flow of the system, if the probability of such a path is so low it may as well be zero, then what are we really observing? A wanderer, a relic, a messenger, or something else entirely? These thoughts began to circulate not in late-night science fiction discussions, but in the private, whispered conversations of people who had dedicated their lives to the laws of celestial mechanics. People who did not believe in miracles. People who did not leap to conclusions. People who, more than anything, disliked mysteries that refused to fit into neat boxes. But this mystery was not asking to be boxed. It was asking to be seen. And gradually, the tone in observatories shifted from casual curiosity to something more tense, more alert. Scientists who once dismissed the irregularities now found themselves drawn deeper into the data, unable to shake the feeling that this was not just another visitor, that perhaps without realizing it, humanity was standing at the threshold of something monumental, something that had slipped through the cosmic shadows and chosen this place, this time, this star. The world still slept, unaware of the improbability unfolding above it. The newspapers were quiet, the governments indifferent, the public unsuspecting. But in the minds of those who watched the object carve its impossible path, a realization was beginning to form. A realization that would soon ripple outward, disturbing the peace of countless assumptions. Because sometimes the universe doesn't simply allow you to witness a mystery. Sometimes it gently pushes you toward the edge of understanding, guiding you closer, whispering with each precise curve of an orbit that nothing is ever truly random, and that some travelers carry with them not just ice and dust, but stories written in the language of impossibility. And this story was only beginning to reveal itself. As this interstellar traveler continued its glide inward, scientists began turning their attention not only to its orbit, but to something even more unsettling, its sheer physical presence. Because once the brightness measurements were refined, once the reflective properties were analyzed and the models rendered, a new truth began to drift forward from the data like a shadow taking shape. Whatever was approaching the inner solar system, it was enormous. Not large by planetary standards, of course, but large in a way that interstellar objects are not supposed to be. Large in a way that felt like another quiet contradiction slipping into the room. Most objects that cross the boundary from interstellar space into our gravitational domain are small, fragile, and rarely worth more than a brief note in an astronomy log. Fragments of ice, shards of long-forgotten comets, debris flung from chaotic star-forming regions, they arrive in silence, leave in silence, and almost never become subjects of obsession. They are cosmic drifters, insignificant and unremarkable. But this one carried weight. By analysing its brightness, researchers estimated its mass, and the number that emerged from the equations did not feel right. It wasn't just slightly larger than previous visitors. It was colossal compared to them, so massive that, statistically speaking, humanity should have first discovered thousands of smaller cousins before ever encountering something of this magnitude. Yet here it was, the cosmic equivalent of finding an ocean liner before finding a rowboat. It is in moments like this that the human mind begins to drift into a strange and quiet unease. Not fear, not panic, just that subtle sense that the world is not behaving the way it should, that something has slipped out of alignment, and the mind so trained to look for patterns leans forward instinctively, trying to understand the shape of the shadow rising before it. The scientist tried to explain away the mass. Maybe the surface was unusually reflective. Maybe the internal structure was porous. Maybe their instruments were overestimating. But every attempt to minimize the number only brought them back to the same conclusion. The object was huge, heavier than anything expected from an interstellar wanderer, its density and momentum marking it as a traveller of a very different kind. And as they watched the readings update night after night, another realization began to spread. With its mass came speed and astonishing, unwavering velocity that carried the object on its path with a momentum that felt almost indifferent to the sun's pull. It was as though it had spent eons travelling through the emptiness, gathering inertia like a story gathers truth, until finally it arrived here, piercing through the darkness with a calm, unstoppable certainty. Imagine standing on a shoreline, watching a distant shape emerge through the fog. At first you think it's a small boat, then a larger vessel, then something even larger still, and with each passing moment the scale of it becomes clearer, until finally you understand that what you assumed was modest is, in fact, vast. That is how the sense of magnitude unfolded with this traveller, not suddenly, but gradually, like the slow lifting of a cosmic curtain. The mass and velocity together created another puzzle, one that pulled scientists deeper into their simulations. Because statistically, if such gigantic objects existed in significant numbers, humanity should have detected countless smaller ones long ago. Small fragments always reveal the existence of large ones. You do not discover a mountain before discovering pebbles. You do not detect a whale without first seeing the fish that surround it. Nature tends to reveal itself in increasing scales, yet here stood the exception. A giant with no known relatives. A traveller that seemed to appear from nowhere, with no preceding chain of debris, no scattered trail of smaller objects to hint at its existence. It slipped into our solar system alone, undetected, and wholly at odds with the mathematical expectations that govern the cosmos. One could almost imagine it travelling through the void like a solitary pilgrim, holding its silence for millennia until finally breaking it by passing into the light of our sun. The scientists tried to bury the discomfort under more data. Maybe the object belonged to a rare population. Maybe humanity's observation systems were not yet sensitive enough to catch the smaller ones. Maybe randomness had played a long, improbable joke on the species that dared to measure the universe. But deep down the discomfort grew, because there is a threshold where coincidence begins to feel like intention, where improbability begins to lean into meaning. And as this traveller approached, its size and speed created the first fragile threads of a narrative that no one dared to articulate openly, not yet. But the thought lingered quietly behind every comparison, every graph, every recalculated orbit. Why was the first large interstellar object humanity encountered also one of the most massive? Why did it arrive with such momentum? Why did it behave not like a piece of cosmic debris, but like something carrying purpose? Of course, the rational explanations were still there. They always are. Science is careful, disciplined, unwilling to leap ahead without evidence. And yet, even within that discipline, there is room for intuition, a soft internal whisper that something about this visitor does not fit. Something about it feels deliberate. And as the days turned into weeks, some astronomers found themselves lingering a bit longer over their screens, staring at the faint point of light, feeling the quiet gravity of a new realization. This was not just a scientific event. It was a story unfolding, a story that was beginning to shift from numbers to meaning, from observation to interpretation, from curiosity to introspection. Because when an object this large arrives from the darkness between stars, it forces you to confront uncomfortable questions. What else is out there? How often do such travellers pass by unseen? What kind of cosmic forces mould something of this magnitude? And if it is not entirely natural, what shaped it? The world had not yet turned its attention to the sky. People went to work, cooked dinner, checked their phones, unaware that a massive visitor was hurtling through space on a path that defied expectations. But in the quiet rooms of observatories, under the soft glow of computer screens, a small group of people knew the truth. Something enormous was coming, and its presence was rewriting the rules. As the object approached the region where sunlight would begin to reveal its surface, anticipation grew. Not excitement, not fear, just a deepening stillness, as though the universe itself had drawn closer, waiting for the next fragment of the story to unfold. And in that stillness, one thought hovered above all others, soft but persistent. This is no ordinary traveler. This is something else. Something that does not drift, something that arrives. And the closer it came, the more the weight of that realization pressed against the edges of human understanding, nudging it gently toward a truth that was waiting to be seen. As the traveler drifted closer and the sun began to illuminate its structure with a brighter, more revealing light, something even more perplexing emerged. Something hidden not in the way it moved, but in what it was made of. For a moment, the scientific world breathed with quiet anticipation, waiting for the familiar patterns to appear on the screens. Water ice sublimating into vapor, carbon monoxide streaming outward in soft curls, the recognizable chemical fingerprints of a typical interstellar wanderer. These are the comforts of astronomy, the predictable signatures that reassure us that the universe still behaves according to the rules we've written for it. But the comfort never came. Instead, the first spectroscopic readings painted a picture that felt increasingly alien. The object's chemical signature did not whisper the cold, expected language of distant comets. It spoke something else, something metallic, heavy, and deeply wrong. The ratios of nickel to iron were the first anomaly. They appeared in quantities far exceeding anything found in natural cometary bodies, so out of balance that researchers paused, recalibrated their instruments, and repeated the analysis, expecting the numbers to correct themselves. But the numbers didn't move. The imbalance persisted like an echo refusing to fade. Imagine tasting a familiar food only to suddenly sense an unfamiliar flavor lurking beneath, subtle but undeniable, hinting that what you're eating is not what you think it is. That was the sensation these readings brought. A sense that beneath its icy exterior, this traveler had a core unlike anything seen drifting through the galaxy. It was as if some ancient process unknown, immense and purposeful, had shaped its interior. And the more they looked, the stranger it became. The ratio of nickel to cyanide compounds was not just unusual, it was extraordinary. 100 times higher than any natural comet on record, a deviation so extreme it felt almost engineered. Natural processes tend to leave fingerprints of chaos, imperfections, variations, irregularities that reflect the violent, unpredictable birthplaces of cosmic objects. But this pattern, this was different. It was clean, sharp, asymmetrical in a way that nature rarely chooses. It is one thing to see an anomaly. It is another to see a pattern of anomalies, each reinforcing the next, each building toward a conclusion that no one is ready to name. The chemistry of the traveler became the next whisper in the long chain of quiet impossibilities, a whisper that seemed to grow louder each day. And then came the water problem. Comets, true comets, carry the signature of their origins in their water content. They are icy nomads, guardians of ancient frozen oceans that once drifted through primordial star nurseries. They sublimate, shedding vapor like breath in cold air, creating tails that stretch behind them in delicate, shimmering arcs. That is the expected behavior. That is the rule. But this traveler held almost no water at all. The fraction detected was so small, so anomalously low, that at first scientists thought the readings were incomplete. But as the object approached the sun, no plume of water vapour appeared, no cometary glow blossomed around it, no familiar signs of sublimation. Instead, other materials, heavier, stranger, unexpected, began to escape into space in thin metallic threads. To the trained eye, it was as though the traveller was made not of frozen oceans, but of something denser, refined in a way that natural cosmic processes do not favour. Too metallic to be a typical comet, too dry to be an ice body, too chemically inconsistent to belong anywhere familiar. Imagine peeling back the bark of a tree only to find polished steel beneath. That is the kind of dissonance the data created. And as the spectroscopic results circled through the scientific community, quiet conversations began to unfold in dimly lit offices and late-night conference calls. The tone was cautious, almost reluctant, because the implications were too heavy to embrace openly, but still, the questions emerged. What kind of interstellar object is formed through processes that concentrate metals like this? What natural mechanism produces such an extreme imbalance? What environment could strip away almost all water, yet leave behind a structured metallic interior? And the most uncomfortable question of all, what if the processes involved were not natural? No one dared to say it aloud, not yet. But the thought lingered like a shadow behind every analysis, because everything about the traveller's composition suggested refinement, selection, purpose. Not the messy, chaotic fingerprints of cosmic formation, but something sharper, something more intentional. But even intention was not the most haunting part. The real unease came from what the composition implied about heat. In order to forge metal-rich interior structures with this level of purity, the temperatures required would be immense, far beyond what an icy interstellar body should ever experience. It was as though, at some point in its existence, the traveller had been subjected to forces so intense they would have melted, reformed, and restructured its interior. Forces that nature does not casually apply. And yet its exterior remained cold, dark, unassuming, a mask of ice hiding a heart of metal. Scientists exchanged messages that read less like technical analyses and more like confessions. Words like unexpected, extreme, unlikely, the safe vocabulary of uncertainty began to appear with increasing frequency in their reports. Behind them, however, lived the unspoken truth. Nature seldom creates contradictions this elegant. Something in the traveller's past had shaped it with precision. This is the moment when curiosity begins to transform into something heavier, something that presses against the edges of human understanding and asks for courage. Because when the universe hands you an object whose chemistry whispers of intention, you stand at the edge of a different kind of mystery. Not one born from distant stars, but from the possibility that someone, somewhere, touched this object long before it reached us. And still, the traveller moved closer. Every new chemical reading was like another layer peeling back, revealing a story etched not in language, but in atoms, ratios, structures. A story of heat and pressure, of refinement and transformation. A story that did not match the birthplaces we know. A story that hinted at processes beyond the reach of natural randomness. It is one thing to observe an object that defies expectation. It is another to watch as it dismantles those expectations piece by piece, revealing a structure that feels almost impossible, as though the universe itself is returning a message written in a dialect humanity has never spoken. A message hidden in metal. A message forged by forces unknown. A message travelling across the darkness for reasons we have yet to understand. And with each passing hour, as the traveller drew nearer to the light of our sun, the sense deepened. This was not simply a visitor, not simply a wanderer, not simply an anomaly. It was a question in physical form, drifting silently toward a species that was only just beginning to ask the right questions. And the most unsettling part was this: the chemistry was only the beginning. And as the chemical secrets of the traveller revealed themselves piece by piece, another truth began to rise from the darkness, one that did not depend on mass or orbit or elemental ratios, but on something far more delicate, far more revealing: light. Because light has a strange kind of honesty. It carries information without interpretation. It reflects what is, not what we hope to see. It travels across unimaginable distances without preference or opinion, holding the details of every surface it touches. And when that light reaches us, it brings those details with it, gently woven into its colour, its polarization, its whisper-thin variations. So when the sun's rays began to brush the traveller from the side, illuminating it with a soft angled glow, astronomers expected clarity. They expected the light to tell the familiar story of dust grains and icy particulate, scattering sunlight in the same gentle patterns seen in comets drifting through the inner solar system. A soft diffusion, a subtle reddening, a graceful tail of reflected photons. But the truth that arrived in the data was nothing like that. Instead, it pushed deeper into the growing strangeness, another quiet contradiction unfolding without fanfare. The first thing that stood out was the polarization. Light bounced from the traveller's surface in a way that defied every known model. At angles where comets typically scatter light with predictable signatures, this object produced a sharp negative polarization more extreme than anything recorded. Not slightly unusual, not mildly interesting, but deeply, jarringly wrong. The pattern looked like the optical fingerprint of an entirely different category of object, one normally found in the frozen outskirts of the solar system, dark as soot, with surfaces shaped by processes far removed from the expected behavior of interstellar visitors. But even those comparisons fell apart under scrutiny, because the degree of polarization was so extreme, so precise, so consistent that no natural surface model fit the data without stretching physics past its breaking point. Light was trying to tell a truth that nothing else in the solar system wanted to match. Imagine standing in a room filled with familiar objects, a table, a chair, a plant by the window, and then noticing a shadow cast on the wall that matches none of them. A shadow too sharp, too dark, too defined to belong to anything present. That is how the polarization felt. a shadow with no source, a signal with no natural counterpart. And yet the more they measured, the clearer it became. The traveller was reflecting sunlight in a way that suggested fine-grained, uniform particulate on its surface, yet not the kind found in comets or carbonaceous asteroids. Something darker, more structured, something that absorbed light with an efficiency bordering on artificial. But even absorption wasn't the true anomaly. The real shock came from the colour. As the sun's rays grew stronger, the traveller brightened rapidly, increasing in luminosity far faster than the models predicted. It was as if the surface wasn't simply reflecting more light, it was reacting to it, shifting in tone, shedding darkness for something colder, sharper. The reflected spectrum became unexpectedly blue, more blue than the sun itself. That kind of colour shift is rare, difficult to produce, and usually associated with peculiar, highly reflective metallic surfaces. But this object was not bright in the way metal usually is. It did not shine like polished steel. It did not glitter like frost or ice. Instead, it glowed with a strange, muted intensity, like something that had been dark for a very long time and was now awakening under the warmth of a star it had not seen in ages. Scientists compared the light curve to every model they had. Nothing matched. The traveller's brightness changed too quickly, its hue too sharply, its scattering too precisely. It behaved not like a natural body warming in sunlight, but like something unveiling itself. Slowly, reluctantly, as though the illumination was pulling truths from its surface that it had carried in silence across the interstellar void. This was the moment when the tension in observatories deepened. No one needed to say anything aloud. The data spoke its own language, and that language hinted at surfaces altered by processes far from the chaos of early star systems. Uniform grains, unusual reflectivity, polarization that suggested engineered texture rather than random cosmic formation. Even the way it brightened under solar exposure felt deliberate, as though the object had been waiting for starlight to wake it. And yet the most haunting part of all was how calmly it did this. No outbursts, no violent jets, no explosive release of energy, just a slow, steady shift in character, a quiet transformation that felt almost biological in its subtlety. Imagine watching an ancient statue in a museum, motionless for centuries, and then noticing that its colour is changing as the sun rises through the window. Not dramatically, not with any visible movement, but with a kind of slow, inevitable awakening. That is how the traveller changed under the sunlight. The brightness readings continued to climb. 2 magnitudes in a day, then another and another. It was as if the object was not simply being illuminated, but discovered, revealed layer by layer by the very star it approached. And as the colour shifted into that strange, faint blue, one question echoed quietly in the minds of those studying it. What kind of surface does this? What kind of material reacts to sunlight with such immediate, structured precision? What kind of object holds darkness for eons, only to reveal brightness when it nears a star? Natural bodies do not behave this way, not with such rapidity, not with such symmetry, not with such repeatability across wavelengths. It was as though the traveller was wearing a cloak one woven from darkness and ancient dust, only to have the sunlight pull that cloak open, revealing glimpses of something smoother, stranger, more uniform beneath. And all the while, the polarization deepened, a signature so sharp it felt less like scattered dust and more like the controlled reflection of a textured surface. Not chaotic, not random, but consistent in a way that physics rarely allows. The world still slept unaware. People went about their routines, their breakfasts, their commutes, their late-night thoughts. But above them, in the cold quiet of space, a surface was whispering truths through light truths that no one had the language for yet. And the deeper scientists looked, the clearer it became. The traveller was not only massive, not only fast, not only metal-rich, it was visually, optically, fundamentally unlike anything drifting naturally through the cosmos. The light it reflected was not the light of a comet. It was the light of something older, darker, shaped by forces unknown. The kind of light that makes you feel watched without understanding why. And as the sun continued to rise in its direction, painting the traveller with brighter and brighter illumination, the next revelation waited just at the edge of visibility. An image that would soon overturn everything humanity believed about this visitor. An image that would make the strange polarization and the impossible blue glow seem almost trivial. Because there are some truths you can learn from chemistry. Some you can learn from orbit, and some you can only learn when you finally see the shape of the thing that is approaching. And the shape was about to reveal itself. And as the traveller crept closer to the inner solar system, light alone was no longer enough to satisfy the growing sense of unease. Scientists needed more than reflections and spectra. They needed to see the visitor, to capture it in full detail, to let its shape speak for itself. And so, telescopes around the world prepared for the moment when the geometry of its path would offer the clearest possible view. The astronomers didn't know it yet, but they were standing at the threshold of a discovery that would ripple through every quiet corner of their minds. The night of November 9th arrived without fanfare. A night like any other cold wind brushing past observatory domes, instruments humming with mechanical patience, red lights glowing softly against the darkness. But inside those domes, in the lonely high-altitude halls filled with whispering electronics, something was different. There was a tension in the air, thin but undeniable, like the faint scent of rain before a storm. At Gemini South, the team watched the final calibration checks scroll across their screens. Pixels aligned, noise filtered, optics cooled. And then, with a simple command, the telescope turned its gaze toward the visitor. There was a moment of quiet anticipation as data began flowing through the pipelines. The first images appeared grainy, as early exposures always are. But then, as the algorithms stacked the frames, sharpening the faint outlines into clarity, something unexpected began to take shape in the darkness. A line. A thin, impossibly straight line stretching outward from the object, extending farther than any natural structure should, perfectly aligned with the direction of the sun, as though it were a blade of light frozen in place. No curve, no twist, no sign of rotation, just a single unwavering filament stretching hundreds of thousands of kilometers into the black. The room went silent. You would expect someone to gasp, or whisper, or mutter a confused sound, but no one did. Instead, the scientists leaned in closer, their eyes narrowing, their breaths shallow. The image sharpened again, showing the structure in even more startling detail. It wasn't diffuse like a comet's tail. It wasn't chaotic or feathered or fanned out by solar radiation. It was smooth, coherent, shockingly narrow, like a column of material being extruded from the object with impossible precision. And then came the second image. Another exposure, another angle, another confirmation. The filament was not an artifact, not a glitch, not a trick of optics. It was real, stretching outward for more than 1,000,000 kilometers, thin as a hair, straight as a laser. It made no sense. Cometary jets never behave like this. They sputter, they break, they twist with the rotation of the nucleus. They form spirals, arcs, corkscrews, beautiful patterns sculpted by physics and chaos. But this was something else. This was stillness. This was control. This was a line drawn by a hand that understood precision far beyond anything nature casually provides. The team checked everything: the telescope, the atmosphere, the exposure settings, even the mount's mechanical stability. But every test returned clean. Every check confirmed the reality of the filament. And when they recalibrated and shot the frame again, there it was, just as straight, just as sharp, just as impossible. Imagine watching a river flow, wild and unpredictable, only to see one single stream of water behave like a steel rod. That was the feeling in the room. A sense of watching the laws of physics themselves hesitate, as though they were unsure whether to intervene or step aside. Word spread quickly within the observatory. Researchers drifted toward the lab in small clusters, drawn by some quiet gravitational pull. They didn't speak at first. They simply stood behind the monitors, arms folded, eyes scanning the impossible filament. The silence held for a long time, broken only by the soft hum of machines and the occasional shift of weight on the cold floor. It was not fear that filled the room, not excitement either. It was something deeper, something like reverence, the kind of hush that falls over a crowd witnessing something ancient, immense, beyond the ordinary. One of the team members finally said what everyone was thinking, though the words felt too soft, too fragile for the moment. That shouldn't be there. The room nodded without speaking. More images were taken, different filters, longer exposures, higher contrast. And with each new frame, the filament remained as perfect as before. No wobble, no segmentation, no variation in width. It was as if the object were emitting a stream that did not care about rotation, turbulence, or the rules that govern every comet humanity has ever observed. But the most disquieting realization came later, when the astronomers ran the data through their rotation models. The traveller was spinning slowly, but undeniably turning on a period of roughly 16 hours. If the filament were a natural jet tied to a vent on the surface, it should have rotated with the nucleus, tracing arcs across the sky, sweeping out spirals as the object spun. Instead, it remained fixed in space, as though the traveller's rotation meant nothing at all. A jet that ignores rotation is not a jet. A stream that does not bend is not a stream. A filament that holds its shape across millions of kilometers is not behaving like gas at all, and still the object emitted it. The scientists knew what the data implied. They knew what the math demanded, but saying it out loud felt like crossing a threshold that none of them were ready for. So they moved quietly, almost ritualistically, through the motions of scientific verification. Check, recheck, confirm, validate, and every time the same truth stared back at them. The filament was real. The filament was fixed. The filament was impossible. By midnight, screenshots were circulating through encrypted channels. Whispered messages passed between observatories. A Slack thread, half panicked and half awestruck, filled with short sentences and long silences. Look at this. Is that straight? Check the orientation. It's fixed. That shouldn't be possible. Are we missing something? No. Then what is it? No one had an answer. The team eventually stepped outside the dome into the cold mountain air, needing space to breathe. The sky above them sparkled with ancient starlight, indifferent to their wonder and confusion. Somewhere out there, hidden among those stars, was the path the traveller had followed to arrive here. A path that seemed less and less accidental with every passing minute. And as they looked up, there was a strange feeling that the universe itself was watching them back. Not threateningly, not warmly, just watching, waiting for the next part of the story to unfold, because what they had witnessed was not the end of a mystery. It was the beginning of one. A sign that the traveller was not simply drifting, not simply a relic, not simply a piece of the cosmos lost to time. It was something more, something that moved with intention or carried intention within it, wrapped in silence. And as the scientists returned inside to continue their work, a quiet realization settled into their minds like the dust of long-forgotten stars. The traveller had revealed its first secret, and it was not a natural one. In the days that followed the first impossible images, the world of astronomy shifted into a quiet, tense rhythm. Sleep became optional, coffee became ritual, and every scientist who had access to the raw data seemed to move with the same slow, deliberate gravity, as though any sudden motion might somehow disturb the fragile balance of understanding that was forming. The filament had changed everything, but the true shock came not from what the eye could see, but from what the numbers refused to hide. The object spun. That simple fact, confirmed through careful photometric analysis, should have settled the nature of the filament once and for all. Every comet rotates. Every jet rotates with it. That rotation carves spirals across the sky, twisting and bending the stream of gas in beautiful, predictable arcs. A spinning nucleus is a sculptor, shaping every plume of escaping material according to the laws of physics. The universe follows these laws with unfailing loyalty. But not this time. The traveller's rotation, measured at roughly 16 hours, was slow enough to be gentle, yet fast enough to leave a signature. And that signature appeared everywhere, except where it should have mattered the most. The nucleus dimmed and brightened with a steady rhythm as it turned. Tiny variations in reflectivity rose and fell like the quiet breathing of a sleeping giant. Light curve analyses confirmed the spin unambiguously, and yet the filament did not move. It held its orientation with such perfect indifference to the object's rotation that at first the scientists assumed they had miscalculated the period. So they recalculated and recalculated again. They used different data sets, different filters, different algorithms. But every version of the analysis returned the same conclusion. The object was rotating and the jet was not following. That single contradiction took root in their minds and began to grow, twisting through their understanding like a vine through stone. For the filament to remain perfectly straight, it would have to ignore not only the rotation, but also the subtle gravitational nudges from the sun, the radiation pressure pushing on its particles, the turbulence created by the traveller's motion. Gas does not behave this way. Dust does not behave this way. Nothing that emerges from a natural vent behaves this way. The only logical explanation, the one they tried hardest not to voice, was that the stream was not tied to the surface at all. It was anchored to a plane in space, fixed in an inertial frame, as if an invisible structure held it in place, indifferent to the body turning beneath it. A tail that belonged not to the nucleus, but to something else, something that did not rotate. The more they examined the geometry, the more the numbers seemed to whisper a truth too strange to accept. A natural vent would twist, a fissure would wobble, even a rigid outgassing fracture would tilt with each rotation. But this line remained frozen, like a needle pointing unerringly toward the sun, straight, unwavering, contemptuously precise. And then came the modelling. A graduate researcher, exhausted but persistent, ran a simulation using the gas speed inferred from the brightness of the filament, 400 meters per second. A typical velocity for sublimated material, nothing extraordinary on its own. But when she extended that speed across the full length of the filament, over 1 million kilometers, an unsettling realization emerged. At that velocity, it would take the gas more than 30 days to reach the end of the visible stream. 30 days. 30 days during which the nucleus completed more than 40 full rotations. 40 rotations that should have braided the jet into a spiraling helix of light. 40 turns that should have carved beautiful corkscrews into the void. 40 opportunities for the filament to reveal even the slightest twist. But there was no twist. The filament, despite containing material emitted across more than a month of rotation, remained a line so straight it might as well have been drawn with a ruler pressed against the canvas of the sky. This was the moment when the numbers stopped being anomalies and started becoming accusations. The mathematics accused reality of lying, or perhaps more accurately accused our understanding of reality of being insufficient. The team gathered around the simulation output, staring at the ghostly spiral projected on the screen, the spiral that should have been there. They watched the lines overlap, cross, twist into the pattern demanded by every law of physics. But the real filament, the one captured by their telescopes, made no such pattern. It cut across space like the path of something that did not care about rotation or turbulence or the chaotic nature of gas. The silence that followed was heavy. Not fearful, just heavy, like the air before thunder. Someone finally broke it with a quiet question, almost whispered, as though speaking louder might make the implications too real. So, what holds it still? No one answered. They were scientists. They were trained to seek natural causes, to build explanations from stone and logic. But every natural mechanism they proposed dissolved under scrutiny. A magnetic field? Impossible at that scale. A stable fragment trapped in the solar wind? The geometry disagreed. A cold jet of crystalline particles? Too symmetrical, too straight, too resistant to disruption. The only models that matched the observations required something none of them wanted to admit: an external structure fixed in inertial space, guiding or containing the filament. Something that remained stationary while the nucleus spun beneath it, like a lighthouse beam shining from a tower that refused to turn. But suggesting such a thing felt like stepping into heresy. So they avoided the word. They avoided the thought. They walked around the truth like people circling a sleeping animal they feared to wake. And yet the truth remained. The filament behaved as though anchored. The nucleus behaved as though unaware. The data behaved as though it wanted to say something no one was ready to hear. The world outside the observatories carried on in its quiet ignorance. People laughed, complained, slept, dreamed, unaware that far above them a question older than humanity was unfolding silently across the sky. But inside those dimly lit rooms full of humming computers and flickering monitors, the scientists were beginning to confront the unspoken. Because numbers do not lie. Numbers do not hesitate. Numbers do not soften their edges to protect our beliefs. And these numbers were pointing toward a structure, real or implied, that should not exist. As the hours passed and the sky above the mountaintop began to pale with the first hints of dawn, the team stared at the final overlay, a comparison of the predicted spiral against the real filament. One a tangled, elegant coil, the other a merciless, unwavering line. Two different universes, one theoretical, one observed. Only one could be true, and as the sun reached over the horizon, spilling light across the observatory dome, a quiet understanding settled over them like a shadow. The traveller was no longer just strange, it was impossible. And impossibility is the first step toward revelation. And as the first light of morning touched the observatory windows, casting long pale reflections across the screens, something unspoken settled into the minds of the scientists. It wasn't a conclusion. It wasn't even a theory. It was more like the soft weight of a realization forming at the edge of consciousness, the way a distant silhouette begins to take shape long before you can identify what it is. They had witnessed something that defied rotation, structure, turbulence, and every comfortable model they trusted. And once an impossibility settles into the room, it refuses to leave quietly. The traveller was not behaving like a natural body. That truth lingered in every equation, every simulation output, every comparison between what the filament should have been and what it actually was. Something was holding it still. Something was anchoring it. Something was controlling its orientation with precision so indifferent to rotation that even the most imaginative natural processes failed to explain it. But naming that something felt dangerous, as if putting it into words would transform an uncomfortable anomaly into a confrontation that humanity was not ready to face. Still, the idea hovered there, subtle and persistent. Imagine holding a compass in your hand, and no matter how you turn, the needle refuses to move. It doesn't shake or hesitate. It simply stays locked, pointing towards something invisible. You would eventually understand that the needle is responding to a force you cannot see. And that force, whether magnetic or otherwise, is real, even if you never expected it to be there. This traveller had a needle of its own, its filament, and that needle was pointing to something no one could see. The scientists walked through the data again, but now with a different kind of awareness, as if they were tiptoeing through a room they realized was not empty. They checked the object's rotation one more time, measured the angles, mapped the filament's direction. The orientation remained perfectly aligned with the sun, unwavering in a way that suggested not freedom, but discipline. As though the filament were obeying an instruction, following a command that existed outside the spinning body from which it emerged. And slowly, reluctantly, the discussions began to drift toward the possibility of a structure. Not a built structure, not yet, but a stabilizing mechanism, something external to the nucleus, something that maintained orientation independent of rotation. It was an idea so absurd in the context of natural physics that even thinking it felt like balancing on the edge of a thin wire. But the numbers offered no other surface to stand on. What kind of structure could resist the torque of rotation? What kind of object could keep a jet fixed in place while its body spun beneath it? What kind of stabilizing system could remain invisible, undetectable, yet affect the orientation with such ruthless consistency? Every natural possibility dissolved under scrutiny. Magnetic stabilization required Field's orders of magnitude stronger than anything the object could produce. A long, rigid fracture on the surface would twist with rotation and carve spirals. A gravitational lock made no sense at this scale. Even exotic dust-clumping mechanisms failed to match the linearity of the filament, and so the scientists found themselves staring at the only answer left, the answer they didn't want. Some kind of external frame. Something that didn't rotate with the nucleus. Something independent of the body's spin. Something that stood still in inertial space, like a skeleton holding the jet in place. Not necessarily artificial, but unnervingly structured. It was like finding the ruins of a bridge in the forest. You might not know who built it or why, but you know instantly that no natural river shaped those beams. The traveller carried its own kind of beams, hidden beneath its shifting brightness, invisible yet unmistakable in the behaviour of the filament. The discussions grew heavier, words slowed, careful, chosen with surgical precision. Scientists who normally spoke in confident, clipped sentences now paused often, as though navigating a landscape of fragile meanings. Because the moment you allow the possibility of structure, you allow the possibility of intention. And the moment you allow intention, you step into territory no one in that room had been trained to explore. What if the traveller had been shaped? Not built in the way humans build things, but shaped by processes that leave fingerprints in the structure, in the orientation, in the persistence of a jet that refuses to move. What if the nucleus wasn't the entire story? Some researchers suggested a shell, a thin, perhaps fragmented layer that could stabilize one axis. Others proposed a lattice of dense material embedded within the object. Not machinery, not architecture, but something that behaved like it. Something that could, in theory, anchor a plume in place even if the body beneath it turned. It didn't require intelligence. It didn't require engineering. It just required an unusual formation process, one humanity had never witnessed. But even those hypotheses felt like whispers compared to the weight of the data, because nature avoids precision, nature avoids symmetry, nature avoids consistency across scales this large, and yet here it was, a 1,000,000-kilometre filament frozen in space, defying rotation, held by something unseen. One scientist finally said what everyone had been thinking but was afraid to form into words. It's behaving like it has a frame. The room went quiet again, but not like before. This silence was a recognition, a shared moment of stepping across a threshold that none of them wanted to approach, but all of them knew was inevitable. The traveller wasn't simply strange, it was structured. Not fully, not mechanically, not in the way of machines, but structured enough that the filament was no longer just a plume of gas. It was a clue that the object had a history far more complex than a drifting fragment of cosmic debris. A clue that it might have been shaped by violent forces, thermal, mechanical, gravitational, far beyond the simple freeze and fracture origins of comets. A clue that something about its past involved precision where chaos should have ruled. The more they examined the data, the more it felt like reading an ancient text written in a language of ratios, orientations, and mineral signatures. A language waiting to be deciphered. A language that didn't care whether humanity was ready to understand it. And as the traveller continued its silent glide toward the sun, the scientists felt something shift inside them. Not fear, not excitement, something quieter, deeper. The feeling that they were no longer observing an object, but encountering a narrative, one written long before the solar system ever existed. Because sometimes the universe doesn't reveal mysteries through explosions or dramatic events. Sometimes it whispers through geometry, through stillness, through the behaviour of matter refusing to obey, and the traveller's stillness, its impossible, unwavering stillness, was beginning to drown out every other part of the story. Soon they knew the world would demand answers. Governments, agencies, academics, the press. But before any of that could happen, before the noise of humanity surrounded the discovery, the scientists stood alone with the truth forming slowly in front of them. The traveller was not simply arriving, it was revealing itself, piece by impossible piece. And the next revelation was coming soon. And yet, even as whispers of structure and stabilization began to weave themselves through private conversations in observatories across the world, there remained a part of the scientific community that refused to drift into the gravity of the impossible. They clung to comparisons, to analogies, to the comforting idea that somewhere in the known catalogue of cosmic objects existed something, anything that behaved even remotely like this visitor. The human mind, after all, craves familiarity. It seeks patterns, anchors, shapes it already recognizes. And so the comparisons began. UN 271, K2. The great distant giants of our own solar system, massive comets with long, cold histories written in the frozen dust of billions of years. These objects had produced jets at astonishing distances. They had emitted material even when sunlight seemed too faint to warm their surfaces. They were, in many ways, the best examples of unusual cometary behavior. But the moment anyone placed the traveler beside them, the illusion of similarity evaporated almost instantly. UN 271's jets, observed at the edges of the Kuiper belt, were wide and diffuse, shaped by slow sublimation and the delicate breath of solar radiation. They resembled soft brushstrokes across the void, beautiful, chaotic, entirely natural. And K2, though impressive in scale, produced emissions that were unmistakably cometary, plumes of activity responding predictably to distance, temperature, and rotation. Neither object emitted a line, neither held structure, neither defied rotation, neither carved a filament into the cosmos with the geometry of intention. And yet, despite the obvious dissimilarities, these comparisons were repeated over and over, almost like a mantra. It's just another extreme comet, some insisted. We've seen large ones before, we've seen distant ones before, we've seen jets at strange angles before. But the comparisons collapsed under even the slightest scrutiny. Because when you overlay the data, when you match the temperatures, the distances, the mass loss rates, the rotational periods, the traveller no longer resembles the large comets of our solar system. It stands apart in every meaningful category. UN 271 and K2 released their material in wide arcs shaped by slow, gentle physics. They responded visibly to rotation. Their jets curved, their emissions dispersed, and nothing they produced stayed coherent for more than a fraction of the distance that the traveller's filament held. You could stack every observation of UN 271 and still never find a straight line. You could analyse every plume of K2 and never discover a filament that refused to twist. The traveller was different, not incrementally, not marginally, but categorically. A difference not of degree, but of kind. And scientists felt this growing divide as a kind of pressure, a quiet tension building behind their ribs. Because the moment you admit that comparison fails, you admit that classification fails. And when classification fails, you are left with something uncomfortably close to the unknown. Still, the attempts to normalize the traveller continued, driven by the instinct to force the universe into familiar shapes. One researcher argued that perhaps the jet was simply unusually laminar, an absurd suggestion to anyone who understood how quickly turbulence dominates at such scales. Another suggested that the rotation period might be miscalculated, despite multiple independent confirmations. A third proposed fragmentation, but the filament showed no sign of discontinuity, no breaks, no widening expected from a fragmented core. It was like trying to explain a whisper by shouting, like trying to rationalize a straight line carved through chaos by insisting it was merely a coincidence. But coincidences do not persist for 1,000,000 kilometers. Coincidences do not defy rotation for 40 cycles. Coincidences do not anchor themselves to inertial space with the stillness of a blade embedded in the sky. and yet the push to anchor the traveller to familiar examples intensified, as though the act of comparison itself could bend reality into cooperation. Observers sifted through catalogues, looking for anything, any precedent, any anomaly, any footnote that might soften the implications. But every comparison made the traveller stand out even more sharply, like a lone figure illuminated by a flashlight in a darkened room. Because the truth was simple, nothing else behaved like this, not in our solar system, not in any recorded data, not in any simulation of natural processes. The more they compared, the more isolated the traveller became. And this isolation brought with it a strange, subtle fear, not the fear of danger, but the fear of acknowledgement. The fear of admitting that humanity was witnessing something unprecedented, something that refused to fit into the quiet catalogues of natural bodies, something that possessed traits that were not just unusual, but mutually incompatible with everything we understand about comets. The traveller did not belong in the company of UN 271 or K2. It did not resemble their dust, their gas, their fracturing, their chaotic outbursts. It did not behave like their jets, their rotation signatures, their flare events. It did not belong anywhere we have looked before. The scientists who understood this felt the quiet shift in their thinking long before they dared voice it. They began to move differently, read differently, speak differently. Their faces held the expression of people standing at the edge of a revelation, afraid that one more step might unveil something their minds were not ready to process. Because the failure of comparison is not just a scientific inconvenience. It is a philosophical earthquake, a reminder that the universe is not obligated to arrange its mysteries in ways that make sense to us. Some resisted this shift, clinging to the comfort of familiar names and categories. They repeated the comparisons with increasing insistence, as though saying, "It's just another UN 271, enough times might make it true." But beneath that veneer of confidence lurked uncertainty sharp, undeniable, growing with every new observation the traveller offered. Others simply fell silent, not out of resignation, but out of recognition that they were looking at something that demanded a different vocabulary entirely. And slowly, inevitably, a new awareness began to crystallize. The traveller did not resemble the largest natural comets we know. It resembled nothing we know, and comparison had become the last refuge of a paradigm slipping out of alignment. Standing in that realization was like standing at the edge of a vast, dark ocean, the surface smooth and silent, hiding depths unseen. The traveller hovered in those depths like a shape just below the surface, visible enough to stir imagination, hidden enough to deny certainty. And the scientists understood finally that they were no longer dealing with an object that could be explained away by analogies. The traveller demanded its own category, not a bigger comet, not a stranger comet, not even an extreme comet, something else, something unclassified, something solitary in its behaviour, something that refused to share a lineage with anything that had come before it. And as that understanding settled softly into the minds of those who dared accept it, a quiet anticipation began to take hold. Because if comparison had failed, then what came next would not be about explaining the traveller through what humanity already knows. It would be about confronting what humanity has never encountered. And the next revelation was waiting just beyond the horizon of comfort. And as the reality settled that the traveller shared no lineage with the great comets of our solar system, another truth began quietly unfolding, one not found in equations or spectra, but in the minds of the people trying to interpret them. It became clear that the next part of the story would not be shaped by data alone. It would be shaped by something far more fragile, far more unpredictable, and far more human. Because when faced with the unfamiliar, the scientific community does not react as a single monolithic entity. It fractures, it hesitates, it weighs reputation against curiosity, comfort against truth, safety against discovery. Some leaned in closer, drawn by the magnetic pull of the unknown. Others stepped back, afraid of where this path might lead. But most hovered somewhere in the middle, suspended between fascination and denial, unwilling to take the leap in either direction. The traveller had become a mirror, revealing not just the behaviour of an interstellar object, but the behaviour of a species confronted with the boundaries of its own understanding. And within that mirror, something subtle but profound became visible: the overwhelming fear of being wrong. Science at its core is built on the promise of questioning everything, but the culture around it, the institutions, the peer review systems, the hierarchies, often punishes those who question too boldly. And so when the traveller behaved in ways no comet should, when its filament refused to twist with rotation, when its composition spoke of unnatural heat and unusual ratios, many scientists found themselves caught between the truth in the data and the consequences of naming that truth aloud. They began speaking in careful phrases, in sentences wrapped in uncertainty, in the soft vocabulary of caution. Words like peculiar, unexpected, challenging, unusual. These were Shield's linguistic tools used to avoid the sharper, more dangerous terms that lingered beneath the surface. Terms like unprecedented, unexplained, non-natural. And yet, even through the fog of caution, a quiet divide emerged. There were those who saw the traveller as a gift and invitation to expand the boundaries of known physics, to embrace a mystery that seemed almost crafted to provoke discovery. And there were those who saw it as a threat not because of what it was, but because of what it implied. A threat to established models, to accepted frameworks, to the comforting idea that the universe is predictable and understandable. One group stared into the data and felt curiosity. The other stared into the same data and felt risk. This divide deepened each day, not through arguments or open conflict, but through silent hesitations, silent doubts, silent calculations of professional consequence. When faced with the unknown, humans often cling more tightly to what is familiar. And in this case, familiarity took the form of insisting, sometimes desperately, that the traveller must be a comet, must be natural, must be explainable, because the alternative was too heavy to consider. In quiet offices, scientists rehearsed sentences they never said aloud. They whispered theories they would never publish. They compared private notes, trying to reassure themselves that they were not imagining the anomalies, that the impossibilities were real, that their doubts were justified. But beyond those whispers lay a deeper truth, one that no one wanted to confront openly. Science is not just about facts, it is about courage, and courage is not evenly distributed. There were researchers who looked at the data and felt a shiver of anticipation, a spark of something primal, the same spark that drove early explorers to wander beyond the edges of their maps. For them, the traveller was not a threat to understanding, but a doorway to deeper understanding. They embraced the strangeness, not with recklessness, but with humility, knowing that the universe often reveals its greatest truths through its most stubborn mysteries. Others, however, felt a tightening in their chest as the anomalies piled up. They knew what stepping outside consensus could cost. They knew that scientific careers are not simply built on discovery, but also on conformity, on aligning with the paradigm rather than challenging it. And so they chose safety over possibility. They sought refuge in old models, forcing the traveller into categories it actively resisted. It's just a hyperactive comet, some insisted. A dusty outgassing event, others said. An unusual but natural vent. A fragmented core. Instrument error. Calibration issue. Misinterpreted angle. Excuses born not from data, but from discomfort. Because the moment you admit that one object breaks the rules, you must consider that many objects may break them. And once you allow that thought, the map of everything you believe about the universe begins to shift. Foundations tremble, certainties dissolve, and for some that is too much to bear. Still, others quietly, steadily pushed back. They were not reckless, they were not sensationalists. They were careful, methodical, honest. They asked questions not because they wanted extraordinary answers, but because the ordinary answers no longer fit. They looked at the filament, at the metallic signatures, at the improbable orbit, and they understood something fundamental. Denial does not change reality. There is a moment in the life of every scientist when the unknown calls to them more loudly than the comfort of being right. And slowly, in small pockets around the world, that moment began to unfold. Some scientists wrote private memos expressing concerns they would not publish. Others drafted papers filled with cautious speculation, only to delete them before submission. A few reached out to colleagues, forming informal alliances of curiosity, sharing notes, building a quiet network of people who understood that something extraordinary was unfolding. It was not a conspiracy. It was not secrecy. It was caution mixed with wonder. But there was another group too, one far larger, far more vocal. The guardians of consensus, the protectors of the model. Those who feared that even entertaining the possibility of the impossible would erode the credibility of science itself. They insisted the traveller must be understood through established frameworks. They invoked Occam's razor with the certainty of a mantra, forgetting that the razor does not cut away truths simply because they are inconvenient. They argued that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, ignoring the quiet truth that extraordinary evidence was already in front of them, stretching across 1,000,000 kilometers like a blade of frozen light. And so the divide grew, not in hostility, but in philosophy. One side believed that the universe is full of surprises. The other believed that surprises are mistakes. One side moved toward the unknown with cautious curiosity. The other clung to known explanations, even when those explanations collapsed under scrutiny. And in this tension, the traveller became not just an astronomical object, but a test of humility, a test of courage, a test of whether humanity could look at something unprecedented and say, "We do not understand this, but we are willing to try." Because the greatest obstacle was not the filament or the metallic composition or the impossible orbit. The greatest obstacle was fear. Fear of being wrong, fear of ridicule, fear of stepping into a space where no consensus existed. And beneath that fear lay something even deeper, something fragile and profoundly human. The fear of letting go of the illusion that we already understand how the universe works. For many, that illusion was safer than truth. But truth does not ask for permission. It arrives quietly, patiently, unbothered by our reluctance. And the traveller, drifting silently through the void, was truth in motion. Soon the world would know. Soon the arguments would escape the walls of observatories and spill into public view. Soon the traveller would force humanity to confront what it had tried so hard to avoid. But before that moment, before the noise and the headlines and the urgency, there was a quiet stillness, a space in which scientists wrestled not with the universe, but with themselves. And in that silence, a realization began to form. The traveller was not just challenging scientific models, it was challenging human nature. And nature, whether human or cosmic, never gives up its secrets without a struggle. And while the scientific world fractured quietly into caution and denial, there were a few, only a few, who found themselves unable to look away from the truth forming in the shadows of the data. These were not the loudest voices or the most radical minds. They were not chasing publicity, nor were they driven by fantasies of extraordinary discovery. They were, instead, the rare kind of scientists who stare at contradictions not with fear, but with an almost sacred sense of responsibility. The kind who understand that reality does not bend to consensus, and that sometimes it is the quietest observations that carry the greatest weight. They had no interest in drawing conclusions too soon. Their motivation was not speculation, but honesty in the face of evidence that refused to be ignored. One of them was a veteran astronomer whose career spanned decades, a man known more for his caution than his boldness. He had spent most of his life studying comets, cataloguing their unpredictable personalities, their volatile moods, their fragile structures. He had seen icy fragments explode into debris fields. He had watched jets flicker and distort under solar radiation. He understood how chaotic these objects could be, and yet when he looked at the traveller, something in him shifted, not toward fear, not toward certainty, but toward clarity. "This doesn't match anything we know," he said quietly in a private message to a colleague, "and pretending it does won't make the data go away." He wasn't making a claim. He wasn't proposing an extraordinary hypothesis. He was simply acknowledging the gap, the growing distance between familiar models and the reality unfolding on his screen. Others like him began to surface, connected not by institutions or conferences, but by the shared gravity of undeniable evidence. They gathered in small circles, digital ones, mostly far from the noise of committees and formal publications. Their conversations were measured, careful, grounded in numbers and observations rather than imagination. But beneath their professionalism was something deeper, a willingness to confront the possibility that the traveller was not simply a statistical outlier, but a sign that the universe still held corners untouched by understanding. They studied the filament's unwavering geometry, the impossible straightness that defied turbulence and rotation. They examined the metallic ratios in the traveller's composition, shaking their heads at values that suggested heat processes no natural comet could survive. They compared the object's mass to the expected population of interstellar debris and found only silence where there should have been thousands of smaller siblings. And in that silence, they heard something else, the faint echo of a truth waiting to be acknowledged. What made these scientists different was not genius, it was humility. The humility to admit that the universe does not owe humanity simplicity. The humility to accept that sometimes the cosmos reveals something that forces you to question everything you thought was certain. The humility to listen when the data whispers instead of shouting. They did not claim the traveller was artificial. They did not claim it was purposeful. They did not leap into sensationalism. Instead, they said the words that others avoided. We do not know what this is. And in science, those words spoken honestly hold more courage than any declaration. The more they spoke privately, the more they began to feel the subtle resistance from others. Some colleagues reacted with nervous laughter. Others reacted with irritation, even frustration. A few responded with the kind of professional condescension that is more about ego than evidence. But the truth-tellers remained steady, not combative, not defensive, simply unwilling to pretend the traveller fit models that were breaking under their fingertips. One of them, a younger researcher, wrote late one night to her mentor, unable to quiet the thoughts circling in her mind. "It feels like we're trying to force the universe into a shape it doesn't want to take," she typed. "It feels like the traveller is teaching us something, and we're too afraid to listen." Her mentor replied not with reassurance, but with a simple truth. Listening is the first step. Understanding comes later. These scientists began drafting notes not for publication, but for clarity. They compiled anomalies, mapped contradictions, and built careful case studies that outlined everything the traveller was and everything it refused to be. They tabulated spectra, plotted rotation curves, ran thermal models, compared the jet's coherence to every known physical process. The deeper they looked, the more the traveller resembled a puzzle with one critical piece missing. Not wrong, not contradictory, just incomplete. And the realization grew that perhaps the missing piece was not in the data, but in humanity's framework for interpreting it. Some of these scientists began advocating quietly for open access to all observations. They called for transparency, for the release of raw images, for the sharing of FITS files that could be independently analyzed. They believed that mysteries of this scale should not be filtered through the narrow pipelines of committees or gatekeeping. They believed that if the traveller was truly unprecedented, then humanity as a whole deserved to witness it, openly, honestly, without layers of interpretation. But not everyone agreed. There were institutions that hesitated, fearing misinterpretation, fearing public reaction, fearing that releasing the raw data would invite speculation they could not control. And so a subtle tension emerged between the guardians of information and the seekers of truth. A tension not born from malice, but from caution, the same caution that had driven so many to dismiss the anomalies in the first place. Yet the truth-tellers did not push aggressively. They understood that pressure only hardens resistance. Instead, they continued their work, documenting the traveller with the quiet determination of people who know that the universe does not reveal its secrets to the impatient. They moved slowly, deliberately, building a foundation of undeniable facts that even the most conservative voices would have to acknowledge eventually. One evening, as the traveller drifted closer to the sun, one of the senior astronomers paused over his notes, staring at a sketch he had drawn of the filament, a long, slender line anchored by an invisible point. Something about the drawing unsettled him, not because of what it showed, but because of what it suggested. He leaned back in his chair and whispered to himself, "This is not a comet, it's a question." And that was the heart of it. The traveller was not a message, not a warning, not a sign. It was a question posed in the language of physics, geometry, and silence. And the scientists who dared to look at it honestly understood that they were standing at the threshold of something profound. They were not ready to answer that question, but they were ready to acknowledge it. And that alone set them apart in a world that preferred comfortable fictions over uncomfortable truths. As the object continued its slow descent toward the inner solar system, these few researchers felt a growing sense of responsibility, not to explain, not to conclude, but simply to see, to observe without distortion, to honor the data rather than the desire for simplicity, because they understood something essential. Truth does not need belief to exist. It only needs witnesses. And soon the traveller would offer humanity something even more startling than its filament. Something that would test not just scientific frameworks, but the very willingness of a species to confront the unknown without turning away. The question was approaching its answer, and the answer was drawing closer with every breath of sunlight, and as the traveller continued its silent approach, carried by the steady pull of the sun, something began to shift, not in the object itself, not in the data, but in the world around those who studied it. What had started as private conversations, hesitant messages, and quietly exchanged observations began to leak into the wider scientific community, not through official reports or public announcements, but through the simple, unstoppable nature of curiosity. Human beings may fear the unknown, but they fear silence even more. And so the truth, fragmented, incomplete, wrapped in caution, began to move. First it drifted through back channels, private emails between researchers who normally never collaborated, informal discussions during late-night conference calls, whispered comments exchanged during telescope handovers. It spread not like wildfire, but like morning fog, soft, slow, impossible to pin down, yet growing thicker with every hour. Those who had seen the raw filament images could not unsee them. Those who had measured the rotation could not pretend it didn't exist. Those who had compared the traveller to known comets knew the comparison failed, and soon enough, those truths began finding their way into the minds of others, people who had heard rumours, people who had seen unexplained graphs, people who sensed that something in the usual language of observation had shifted. But even as awareness grew, resistance grew with it. Official channels remained quiet. Press releases stayed within the boundaries of familiar phrasing. Reports emphasized uncertainty over anomaly, caution over curiosity. Early observations remain inconclusive. More data is needed. The object appears unusual, but likely natural. Sentences crafted like fences, built not to clarify, but to contain. Yet no fence can withstand the pressure of collective wonder. The more the traveller's impossibilities circulated, the more questions followed. Some were born of excitement, others of unease, but all pulled in the same direction, toward understanding. Researchers outside the small inner circle began requesting access to the raw data. Observatories in other parts of the world pointed their instruments toward the object, eager to verify or refute the anomalies. Students, the most fearless of all, began discussing the object in forums and shared documents, sketching their own models, comparing notes, pushing gently but relentlessly at the boundaries of what little was known. And with each new independent observation, the truth became harder to ignore. The filament was real. The straightness was real. The alignment was real. The rotation was real. Contradiction was real. One cannot argue with a shadow cast on the wall when the object casting it sits plainly in the center of the room. Still, the more the truth spread, the more the guardians of caution tightened their grip. There were discussions measured, serious, full of the language of responsibility, about withholding data until a consensus could be formed. There were concerns about public reaction, about sensationalism, about the risk of misunderstanding. These were not bad intentions, they were protective instincts. But protection can sometimes become obstruction, and obstruction can sometimes look like denial. And scientists feel denial like a splinter small, but impossible to ignore. Among those watching the situation unfold were a few who realized that waiting for consensus might mean waiting forever. They understood that the traveller was not simply an anomaly that would quietly resolve itself with time. It was a window, and windows have a way of closing if you hesitate too long. And so, in the margins of official structures, a subtle momentum began to build. A retired astrophysicist, once known for his conservative stance, wrote a private letter to a major observatory director, urging transparency. A group of graduate researchers compiled an unofficial report summarizing all confirmed anomalies, distributing it quietly among peers. A postdoctoral fellow leaked an early graph of the filament's angle stability, not to cause controversy, but because she could not bear to watch the truth suffocate behind caution. Each act was small, each act was insignificant on its own, but together they formed something powerful, a quiet rebellion of honesty. And honesty, once it gains momentum, is impossible to stop. Soon the traveller was no longer just a curiosity, it became a point of global conversation. Online forums speculated, media outlets hinted, amateur astronomers attempted their own measurements. Most of the speculation was wrong, as speculation tends to be, but it didn't matter. The important part was that the object was being seen, truly seen, by more than just the cautious few. Truth had escaped its cage. Yet with this new attention came something else, something subtler, something more human. A sense of collective anticipation, a feeling that whatever the traveller was, whatever it represented, it was about to reveal something that stretched far beyond scientific models. The object had gone from a distant curiosity to a mirror held up to humanity's imagination. It reflected our fears, our hopes, our longing to understand our place in the cosmic vastness. Some feared the traveller, some revered it, some dismissed it, some were captivated by it, but no one could ignore it. And through all of this, the object continued its silent approach, indifferent to debate, indifferent to excitement, indifferent to the fragile anxieties of the species observing it. It moved through the void with the serenity of something ancient, something patient, something unfazed by the frantic attempts of a young civilization to fit it into the boxes of understanding. In the midst of growing global attention, a remarkable thing began to happen. The scientists who had once felt isolated in their observations began finding each other. Conversations that had been whispered became spoken. The quiet first steps of curiosity became open discussions. Fear slowly gave way to collaboration, doubt to shared analysis. They were not united by belief, but by honesty. And in that honesty, a new kind of clarity began to form. The traveller did not fit natural models. It did not follow cometary behaviour. It did not obey rotational dynamics. It did not fracture like an icy nucleus. It did not scatter light like dust. It did not resemble anything that the solar system had ever welcomed. It was not that the traveller pointed to an extraordinary conclusion. It was that it refused to point to an ordinary one. And once you remove the impossible, once you strip away every explanation that breaks under scrutiny, you are left standing in front of a truth that asks you to step beyond what you think you know. And humanity had just taken its first step. The traveller, still distant, still silent, still shrouded in its impossible geometry, carried within it something even stranger than filament or composition or orbit. It carried inevitability, the inevitability of revelation, of change, of a question finally demanding an answer. And as the world leaned closer, drawn not by fear but by awe, the scientists who had followed the truth from the beginning felt something shift deep inside them. The traveller was no longer merely approaching, it was preparing for what they did not yet know, but they could feel it, in the data, in the silence, in the weight of everything the object refused to explain. Something was coming, something the traveller had carried across the darkness for longer than humanity had existed. And soon, very soon, the next piece of its truth would finally reveal itself. The closer the traveller came to the heart of our system, the more the difference between it and everything else became impossible to hide. Planets circled in their quiet obedience. Asteroids tumbled in clumsy, indifferent arcs. Dust drifted where gravity and light allowed it to drift. But the traveller did not drift. It proceeded. There is a difference, a small one in language, but a vast one in meaning. Drifting is surrender. Proceeding is intention. And though no one could yet say what intention, or whose, or whether intention was even the right word, the feeling lingered, like a pressure in the air before a storm. By now, the world had turned its attention to the sky. Articles appeared, some cautious, others breathless. News anchors stumbled over technical terms. Comment sections filled with speculation. Some said it was just another space rock. Some said it was a sign. Some said it was nothing. Some said it was everything. But above the noise, in the quiet rooms where raw data flowed without headlines, the mood was different. Not dramatic, not panicked, just sharpened, aware. As though everyone present understood that whatever the traveller was, they were now past the point where it could be dismissed as misinterpretation. The object had adjusted to the sun. It had narrowed its impossible filament. It had shaped, however gently, the environment around it. Now it reached the distance where many comets break, where the stress of heat and gravity and outgassing fractures them into a scattering of shattered arcs. Astronomers watched, waiting for the first crack, the first flare, the first sign that perhaps it too was mortal in the way natural objects are. Nothing cracked, nothing flared, nothing broke. The traveller remained whole, silent, balanced, unbothered. And as it held itself together under forces that should have torn it apart, a strange calm settled over those who watched. The fear began to fade, not because the object became less unknown, but because the unknown began to feel less hostile. There was no threat in its movements, no acceleration, no targeting, no deviation toward the planets. It did not turn, it did not aim, it did not reach. It simply followed its path, as if the solar system were not a destination, but a checkpoint along a route traced long before humanity ever learned to draw maps. In that realization, a shift occurred, not in the sky, but in the minds of those looking up at it. For months the traveller had been the subject of questions that all pointed outward. What is it? Where did it come from? Who, if anyone, made it? What does it want? But now, quietly, another type of question began to form. Questions that turned inward instead of outward. Why were we so desperate to call it a comet when it clearly wasn't? Why did we cling so tightly to broken models instead of accepting that we needed new ones? Why did the idea of something unprecedented frighten us more than the idea of being wrong? The traveller did not judge. It did not accuse. It did not demand. It simply existed in a way that made our habits visible. We saw in it our reluctance to admit ignorance. We saw in it our instinct to normalize the extraordinary. We saw in it the limits of our own imagination, because the object had never been the problem. The data had always been clear, from the orbit to the mass, from the filament to the strange chemical fingerprint, from the impossible stability to the quiet interaction with the space around it. The problem had been our reaction. We did not lack information. We lacked the courage to follow it. And so, as the traveller reached its closest approach to the sun, bathing in a light that would have vaporized a lesser body, something almost paradoxical happened. The tension did not peak, it dissolved. Observers realized that they were not waiting for an event, a signal, an impact, or a revelation in the form of some dramatic gesture. The revelation had already happened. The revelation was the object itself, an object that defied our categories, an object that embodied impossible stability, an object that carried internal rules we did not understand. It didn't need to flash or speak or break apart to mean something. Its existence was the message. Somewhere in a darkened office, a researcher rested his forehead against the edge of his desk and laughed softly, not out of humour, but out of the strange relief that comes when you finally stop fighting what's in front of you. We wanted it to either be nothing, he whispered to the empty room, or everything. Then he lifted his head, eyes lingering on the data plots. But it's neither, he said. It just is. And in that simple sentence lay the quiet maturity that humanity had been approaching, step by reluctant step. Not every mystery exists to validate hope or fear. Some exist to reveal the shape of our own assumptions. The traveller was not a hero, not a villain, not a prophecy, not a threat. It was a test of whether we could accept that the universe is stranger than our textbooks, without immediately turning that strangeness into a story about ourselves. For some that was disappointing, for others it was liberating. Because if the universe can produce something like this, whether through natural processes we don't yet understand, or through civilizations whose motives we may never know, then one quiet truth becomes inescapable. We are not nearing the end of understanding. We are standing at its beginning. The traveller, indifferent to the meaning projected onto it, curved gently around the sun, its path bending in perfect obedience to gravity. The filament howled. The halo pulsed. The systems we could not name remained stable. And then slowly, gracefully, the object began to recede, not toward Earth, not toward any planet, back outward, away. It had entered our sky without invitation. It had refused to fit our categories. It had pressed against the edges of what we thought was possible. And now it was leaving, carrying its secrets with it, as silently as it had arrived. There were no final flares, no sudden transmissions, no last-minute changes in trajectory, just the smooth, inevitable arc of an object that had followed its own rules across distances so vast that human timelines felt weightless by comparison. In the months and years that followed, debates would continue, papers would argue, models would evolve. Some would insist the traveller was entirely natural. Others would quietly suspect it wasn't. Many would hover in between, unwilling to commit to an answer that might never be confirmed. But beneath those disagreements lay something more important than consensus: a new humility. We had seen, with our own instruments and our own eyes, that the universe is capable of producing, by whatever means, objects that defy our expectations so completely that they force us to reconsider what natural even means. We had learned that clinging to old explanations is not caution, it is fear, and that admitting we don't know is not weakness, it is the beginning of wisdom. The traveller gave us no clear message, No decipherable code, no dramatic declaration. Instead, it left us with a question that does not point at the sky, but at ourselves. When the universe shows us something we don't understand, will we change our minds, or will we try to change the universe to fit them? In the end, the most alien thing in this story was not the object that crossed our system. It was our own reflection in it. A reflection of a species standing on the shoreline of an ocean it barely comprehends, trying to decide whether the waves are frightening or beautiful or simply real. One day, another traveller will come, maybe stranger, maybe clearer, maybe carrying answers, or maybe not. Maybe the universe will keep sending us questions instead, wrapped in metal and silence and impossible geometry, until we learn to stop demanding that they resemble us. The traveller is gone now, a dimming trace in the catalogues of observation, a faint signature drifting back into the deep, indifferent dark between stars. But the echo of its passing remains, in new models, in careful notebooks, in late-night conversations, in the quiet shift of a civilization that, for a brief moment, was forced to admit that it had met something it could not tame with names. And somewhere, in that vastness, the object continues on its path, unchanged, unhurried, unburdened by what we thought of it. It was never here to answer us. It was here to remind us that the universe does not live inside our explanations. We live inside its questions. And in the long quiet that followed the traveller's departure, something unexpected settled across the world. Not panic, not awe, not the feverish excitement of revelation, but a kind of gentle stillness. A recognition. A realization that the story had not ended with answers, but with perspective. The traveller had come and gone without bending its path, without sending signals, without seeking contact, without altering its trajectory by even a fraction of a degree. It had passed through the solar system like a shadow across a field, quiet, patient, indifferent, and yet everything felt changed, not because the object had revealed its purpose, but because it had revealed ours. Because in its silent crossing, it had made humanity look at itself through a different lens. One polished not by hope or fear, but by humility. The astronomers who had spent months staring at data streams and smoothing curves and aligning spectral lines now found themselves returning to empty observatory halls, to quiet desks, to machines that no longer hummed with urgency. They returned to normal work, to familiar tasks, to other comets and asteroids and predictable bodies moving across predictable orbits. But something in their gaze had shifted. They looked at everything differently now. Graphs no longer felt like absolute truths. They felt like interpretations. Models no longer felt like cages. They felt like guesses. Certainty no longer felt like strength. It felt like confinement. A few of them gathered quietly one evening, months after the traveller's passing, in a small office lined with star maps and coffee-stained printouts of light curves. They sat together without ceremony, just as they had during the object's most impossible moments, and reflected on what had happened. No one preached, no one theorized, they simply shared the silence. One of them finally spoke, his voice calm and almost grateful. "You know, I think we expected too much." Another replied softly, or maybe too little. The room exhaled, because both statements were true. They had wanted the traveller to fit into their categories, and they had wanted it to shatter them. They had wanted it to be a comet, and they had wanted it to be a message. And in the end, it had been neither. Its significance lay not in what it did, but in what it refused to do. It refused to obey rotation dynamics, refused to react to sunlight as expected, refused to fracture, refused to change orbit, refused to care about interpretation. It remained itself, fully quietly, completely, a visitor with no desire to explain, a phenomenon with no interest in narrative. And in its refusal to answer questions, it taught us to ask better ones. For months afterward, research papers appeared cautious, measured, filled with data and caveats. None claimed the traveller was artificial. None claimed it was natural. They did what the best science does. They admitted what was known. They admitted what wasn't. And they left room for wonder. One paper, written by a normally conservative physicist, ended with a single sentence that captured the essence of everything the traveller had left behind. Some objects are not puzzles to be solved, but reminders to keep looking. And humanity did keep looking. Amateur astronomers, inspired by the event, began scanning the sky more diligently. Students who had never cared for astrophysics before found themselves drawn into the field. New telescopes received funding. Old data sets were reanalyzed. Instruments were recalibrated with greater sensitivity, not because the traveller demanded it, but because it had awakened a part of the species that had gone quiet in the routine of knowledge, curiosity without borders. And somewhere deep in that curiosity lay something even more profound: acceptance. Acceptance that the universe is capable of producing structures, systems, and behaviours that we do not yet understand, and that this does not diminish the universe's beauty. Acceptance that not every mystery arrives to be solved. Acceptance that not every visitor comes with intention. Acceptance that silence can be as meaningful as a message. The traveller became a symbol not of fear or hope, but of openness. A reminder that the unknown is not an enemy, it is a horizon. And on clear nights, long after the object had vanished into the cold distances between stars, many of the scientists who had studied it found themselves stepping outside, looking up at the sky, not with the urgency of analysis, but with the quiet reverence of people who had glimpsed something vast. They looked for a hint of the filament's impossible straightness. They looked for the faint blue shimmer of its surface. They looked for the pulse of its quiet halo. Of course they found none, but that wasn't the point. The point was that they looked differently now, with less arrogance, with more humility, with a willingness to see without immediately naming. For the first time in a long while, the sky felt big again. One night, long after the world had moved on, a young student one who had followed the entire story through late-night streams and shaky telescope footage stood outside a small observatory and whispered into the darkness, "If you ever pass this way again, we'll be here, a little wiser this time." It was not a prayer, it was not a plea, it was simply acknowledgement, because in the end, the traveller had given humanity something far more valuable than answers. It had given it beginnings. A beginning of new frameworks, a beginning of new questions, a beginning of new humility. And somewhere, drifting through the interstellar dark, the object continued on its unknowable path, unhurried, untouched, unchanged by its brief intersection with a curious species orbiting a small, ordinary star. It would never know the impact it had, but that too was part of its quiet lesson. The universe is not responsible for shaping us. We are responsible for shaping ourselves in response to what the universe shows us. The traveler disappeared into the black, but it left a doorway behind. A doorway not to understanding, but to wonder.